Tonight, if any of you want to ask any questions, I understand we can do that as we're going through some of this, and I'm going to perhaps go a little more slowly and a little more in a popular vein tonight. Some of the topics that we're going to be touching are, you might say, almost more popularized, I hope, and therefore you may have some questions, so please feel free. Mr. Venari assures me that his electronic equipment can pick you up, but my only request, if you have a question, speak up so that it can pick you up. So let's proceed, if I think everybody has some of the notes here. And we'll start with point 2, having assumed that we've exhausted point 1, at least for the time being. If you have any questions pertaining to prior matter, there again, don't hesitate to pop up with them. We're going to take as a point of departure the presumption that we have already demonstrated the existence of God, at least as it is expressed in the De Ente et Essentia, the unbeing in essence, which was an opuscula, a little work written by St. Thomas when he was only about 30 years old. It is sometimes thought or been said that this was one of his earlier efforts, as if perhaps this was not a fully matured St. Thomas. It was written for his confreres in the Dominican order as a kind of summary of metaphysics for them, but of course scholars ever since then have been plumbing the depths of the De Ente to try to understand exactly what he was saying. So even in his purportedly weakest moments, he's still far outshone anybody else. But at the same time, there are insights in the De Ente which I would suggest are replayed in his later works. For example, this argument that we've gone through to prove God's existence, I would suggest is actually the prototype or the exemplar which was used in most, if not all, of the 5 ways. Everybody talks about St. Thomas having 5 ways to prove God's existence. That's hardly the case. He has a number of other arguments expressed in different ways in different places, and this one that we looked at, of course, is the one that he did when he was a relatively young man. Of course, he didn't get to be a very old man, did he? But he 49, yes. That's due to not being a good horseman, I believe. he unfortunately ran into a tree limb on the way to a council, and it is suspected that he died of a subdural hematoma, from what we can determine. So in the 19 years after he wrote the De Ente, he wrote everything else. And anybody who tells you that he's read all of St. Thomas probably needs to go to confession. Undoubtedly does. So that this argument from the De Ente bears the major steps that you find in the other 5 ways, because in every one of the 5 ways you begin with a series of effects which require a cause or causes, and then you show that you cannot have an infinite regress in the taking of simultaneous prior causes, and therefore you come to a first cause uncaused. In the prima via, of course, it would be the first mover unmoved. In the secunda via, it would be the first cause uncaused. In the third way, the tertia via, it would be the necessary being whose necessity is itself. In the fourth way, of course, you have the supreme being, the highest of all possible beings. And then the fifth way, you have the argument from finality leading to, which is actually an argument of governance, leading to a supreme governor of the universe. And when you try to assemble the nature of God, you draw from each of these 5 ways. But in each of the 5 ways, you're using the same kind of reasoning that you find in the deity. You begin with a series of effects, because as we saw here, every finite being is composed of essence and existence. Therefore, it is an effect and requires a cause. Ultimately, if you start looking for the cause or causes for such effects, either immediately or through a series of intermediate causes, you must come to a first cause uncaused, which in the deity would be a being in which essence is identical to existence, a being which is infinite because it possesses every possible perfection and actuality of existence. So this would be, of course, contain the notion of a supreme being. It would be the first cause. It would be the first mover of all things. It would be the ultimate creator of everything, and hence the designer and governor of all things. So that the prototype for the other 5 ways is already expressed, even when St. Thomas was writing on the deity et essentia. So anyway, let's go to point number 2 here, unless you have any questions about this part that we already covered. And of course, one cannot restate too strongly that beautiful insight, which is arguably drawn from Exodus 3:14, where God answers Moses when he asks, who should I tell the people of Israel has sent me to you? And he says, tell them, he who is has sent you to them. He who is the essence of God. When he says, tell him, or when he says, I am who am, really this would amount to saying, if it didn't mean something intelligible, it would just mean like, tell them it isn't their business. If you say, I am who am, it means nothing. God would not reduce himself to such a ignominious expression. When he says, I am who am, he is actually telling him, you might say, the metaphysical secret of his very essence. God is pure existence. And of course, he makes it very clear that he's not just brushing him off in the next couple lines when he says, he who is has sent you to the Israelites. He who is expresses the meaning of I am who am. It's not just a trite saying of I am who I am. That would be, that would almost say nothing. Unfortunately, in the Catechism, I think you will find that the translation which is expressed there says, I am who I am. And I am at a loss to understand how that could have come to be. As a matter of fact, Dr. Waters was intending to write to then Cardinal Ratzinger and ask him why it was done in this fashion, because surely the meaning is clearly expressed 2 lines later when he says, when God says that he is he who is. So it's not just saying I am who I am. That says nothing.
And how many layers of editorial process does that have to go through and clear? It's just not one person.
Right.
The layers of editorial process to put out something like that is pretty thick. And it got through.
Yes. I don't know, I'm speechless. I don't know what to make of it. But clearly St. Thomas Aquinas didn't read it that way. Okay. And with good cause. All right, let's go to point number 2. Tonight we will talk about natural theology. Metaphysics is the study of being as being. Not being as mobile, not being as movable. That's physics. Physics is the study, sometimes people say, well, in physics you study sensible being, insensibile. No. Sensible being is only part of movable being. Most of the physical world is not sensible. When talking about what is sensible, you're talking about what is filtered through a human being's 5 senses. And we don't know very much. We surely don't know subatomic particles directly. We don't even perceive the radio transmissions that are coming through this room at this moment. So it's not insensibile. It's movable being, ens mobile, which is the subject matter of physics. It's being qua movable, being as movable. But metaphysics, which goes beyond physics, is the study of being as being, not as movable, because it is possible for some beings to not be movable or subject to change. Clearly, God is the prime example. The study of metaphysics is a study of being as being. We begin with the beings that we experience in the world around us. And from it, of course, as we've just shown, it is possible to raise our understanding and our judgment to an awareness of the existence of a supreme being, a being which utterly transcends this world and transcends the beings with which we began the study of metaphysics. So the subject matter of metaphysics is being as being. From the standpoint of us as learners, it's being as we encounter it in the sensible world. Because that's the only place we can ever begin any knowledge of anything. We begin with our senses, and that, of course, is what makes it so difficult. That's why St. Thomas and Aristotle make a distinction between something that is more intelligible in itself as opposed to something more intelligible as to us. The things of this world are more intelligible to us because, given the limited knowledge of our senses, this is all that we immediately know. Does that mean that the most knowable things are the things of this world? Clearly not. God is the supreme intelligible. God is the ultimate source of all intelligibility of all things. And yet God is trans-sensible, trans-intelligible to us, utterly beyond our ability to understand. We can only reason indirectly from examining the effects of God back to understanding that there must be a first cause, which we call God. God is the supreme intelligible. That means the greatest knowability of all things resides in the ultimate cause of the universe. But it's not the most knowable thing to us in this life, surely, because we're restricted only to that which we perceive through our senses. So we always make a distinction between what is more knowable to us as opposed to what is more knowable in itself. Superior things, such as angelic beings or even the human soul, are more intelligible in themselves because there is more to be known. Intelligible means literally can be something that can be read within. Intus legere, I believe it is. You can read within it. There's something to be known. What is to be known? The nature of something. The purpose that philosophy has is to go beyond the sensible appearances and get to the very nature of something. Get to understanding it in itself, in its essential characteristics or notes. But we begin with the sensible appearances. We have to penetrate beyond those appearances. The local ape or canine has experience of the same sensible experiences, but it doesn't understand the nature of things. We, because we have an intellect can actually read what is intelligible in things and come to understand the nature of things in an essential way. Not very many things, perhaps, but we are able to know, with the assistance of Aristotle, for example, that man is a rational animal. That's his essential nature. That's a very real thing in us that differentiates us from irrational animals such as that ape or canine. It is a very real operating principle. It's something that makes us be and to be the kind of being that we are, and it is something that is in a way hard to penetrate, but it is the source of everything that we do. When you encounter another human being, you only encounter their sensible accidents. You encounter what they say to you, the sounds they utter, the motions that they make. And yet, through these, what's underneath them and what is behind them is their nature, their being, their substance, that which is the principle from which all these activities come. surely that principle is more intelligible in the sense that there is more to be known in it than you find merely in the sensible accidents that we encounter. But it takes a lot of effort to come to understand what is it in other human beings that makes them different from a mouse or an elephant or a dog. We have to think about it a lot. We have to come to realize and reflect on the fact that we have these abilities to reason, to judge, to understand, to make volitional acts, that's contained within our human nature. And that's that intelligible content that is more knowable in itself because there's more to be known, but less knowable to us at first because all we initially know is what we see and hear and touch and taste and smell. All the more so the case with God. God is the supreme intelligible because contained within him is the essential perfections and knowledge of perfections of anything that could be. Anything that ever has been, could be, will be, anything creatable, anything that doesn't happen to ever get created, but could be created, is found within the essence of God. So God is the supreme intelligible, but to us, we're blind as bats in the face of looking at the sun. God is transluminous to us, beyond what we can perceive. We are blinded by him. We know nothing of him also because we start with just our knowledge of sensible things, and then we have to reason very weakly, very slowly. That's why it's possible for people to be atheists, because it's possible to derail the rational processes that would lead one to God. So anyway, the subject matter of metaphysics is being as being. Now, within metaphysics, you might call it a separate science or subalternate science of metaphysics, we have what is called natural theology. Natural theology focuses on not the subject matter of metaphysics, but the cause of the subject matter of metaphysics. The cause of all being is God. So in natural theology, we are talking about the science of God. Theos, the Greek for God, logos, the Greek for science. So theology is the science of God, but this is natural theology, as opposed to supernatural or sacred or revealed theology. Those sciences, or that science, is taken from revelation. This science is taken from reason alone. And that's why even people think, oh, you're going to do natural theology, you're doing theology. I suspected this all along. You were calling it philosophy, but you're really going to do theology. Well, yes, but you see, would anyone suggest that Plato or Aristotle were theologians in that sense of the term? As a Christian, for example, theologian? Hardly. But Aristotle has a natural theology. He has a study of the first mover unmoved and the properties of that being, which he describes this ultimate first mover unmover as a thought thinking itself, which was a fascinating insight, if you think about it. A thought thinking itself. Surely no one would accuse Aristotle of being a Christian theologian. But he had a theology, a natural theology. So natural theology is a part of philosophy. Again, with respect to the validity of the term God, many times people say, well, the moment you mention God, obviously you're doing theology in the sense of revealed theology or sacred theology. Certainly not. Curiously enough, the term God has been used in a very traditional way, particularly not only in terms of the religious origins that we can trace back to the Hebrew times, but particularly as developed and refined in the early Christian period and ultimately in the high medieval period. So that By the time we get to modern philosophers, they have a conception of God that's pretty highly refined. And one might properly ask, where did they get it from? Certainly when Descartes talks about God, he thinks he's just doing pure philosophy. But his conception of God is absolutely Christian. As a matter of fact, what you find among modern philosophers is in many instances, a denial of God. Somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche certainly absolutely denies the existence of God. But what does he deny when he denies God? He denies the traditional concept of God. If you read the philosophers, invariably they deal with God. Bertrand Russell, nobody would accuse him of being a Christian. And yet, in his little work, Why I Am Not a Christian, he clearly rejects the notion of God in a traditional sense. Anthony Flew, at least for a long time, denied the existence of God in a very traditional sense of the term. Modern atheists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Émile Camus, all of these people deny God, but they are not just denying any old God, they're denying the traditional God which was in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They understand by God a transcendent, first being, personal, omnipotent, omniscient, necessary being. They all understand this concept very clearly. They will take great pains to deny such a being, or to deny the knowability of such a being, or deny that it is possible to demonstrate the existence of such a being. But that which they reject is a traditional conception. Philosophers always refer to God, and they will say, they will address themselves to the question, do they believe in God? Now, some will say, well, I believe in God, but my God is, and you notice they'll always make a distinction because they know full well they're not talking about the traditional concept of God. They've got a different notion, very different notion, and they feel the need to define it. I mean, they might say, my God is this microphone. You know, people worship anything. But in so doing, they have defined something that is not the traditional meaning of the term, and they know it. So every major philosopher and every minor philosopher addresses the question of God's existence, and they do so in a very traditional way, with very, very few exceptions, I would dare say. Some of them will propose other conceptions of God, but to the extent that they deviate from the traditional, they'll always tell you how they deviate, because they have to. When somebody uses the term God for virtually 99% of the people, it has the same general meaning. Some people have more specific understanding of it, obviously. And clearly our understanding of God was profoundly affected not only by Judeo-Christian revelation, but also by the theological and philosophical speculations of Judaism and Christianity coming up through the medieval period, even up to today. But the major outlines, the major notes of God were already well known, even if not as well understood, in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries and well before that. So the term God is a philosophical term. The fact that you use it doesn't make you not a philosopher. What you do with it, of course, determines what kind of philosopher you are. You might be an atheist, you might be an agnostic, well and good, but you still will be using the term God. So let's run through this little glossary of terms to see how some of the major terms are used. Theism is derived from the Greek theos, and this represents a belief in the traditional notion of God in some form. It may be, this does not, just looking at the term theism, that doesn't address how the person gets there. It could be a matter of pure belief. It could be a matter of rational demonstration. Most people will say that they believe in God. Probably most people will say that's all you can do is believe in God. And you'll find even those in the Catholic or Anglican traditions who really ought to know better, who will also say the same thing, ignoring completely the fact that arguments for demonstrations for the existence of God have been around even from the time of Plato and Aristotle. If you look at the next sheet, and again, don't hesitate to stop me on any one of these if you've got questions to ask, if I haven't gone far enough in describing it. The thought that we can rationally demonstrate the existence of God, that comes as a shock to a lot of people. And of course, as Dr. Waters has pointed out before, if you can demonstrate the existence of God, then properly speaking, that's not a matter of belief, that's a matter of knowledge. I mean, if I say there's this microphone in front of me right here, is that a matter of belief? Or do you believe you see this? Or do you see it? If you see it, you're doing a little better than merely believing it. So belief pertains to things that are unseen. Most people say, well, I believe in God. Now, if you demonstrate the existence of God, does that mean you no longer have any belief? Well, there's a couple things you have to watch here. One is, even though you may demonstrate or know how to demonstrate the existence of God, are you doing it all the time? How many of you can demonstrate the quadratic equation? Well, maybe I picked the wrong one. How about the Pythagorean theorem? Did you ever do it when you were a kid? No. Geometry?
Yes.
Okay. Can you do it at this moment? Maybe not. And with a quadratic equation, I'm sure you can't. But you did do it. And when you did it, you could see that it was true at that time. Now you don't see that it's true, but you remember that you did it. You know you did it, but it's a matter of memory. So at this moment, you can say, I believe in God. You can also say, I can know that God exists because I remember that I've done it before. But then, in addition, there's another aspect to this, and that is, what have you demonstrated? You may have demonstrated that there's a first cause uncaused. You may have even demonstrated, with a little bit of work, that that first uncaused cause is what all men call God. But that's a pretty bare-boned conception of God. When you say you believe in God, I suspect you have a very rich and full understanding of the meaning of the term, one that goes far beyond the precision of a demonstration that you learned in philosophy. So there is still room for belief there, because the fullness of your comprehension of what you mean by the term God extends beyond the content that you would have achieved through some kind of philosophical demonstration. And besides, as I say, at this moment in time, I don't know the existence of God because I'm not at this moment thinking about the demonstration. But I do remember that I've done the demonstration, and I know that I can do it if I want to do it. I just don't have time to do it while I'm talking to you. So there is room both for belief and knowledge. One does not contradict the other, but to the extent you know something, you have replaced belief with knowledge, which is okay. And obviously, your belief in God that may be derived from a religious or revealed source, a belief that God is, for example, triune, obviously transcends anything that reason alone could demonstrate, or for that matter, understand fully. Agnosticism. We could take agnosticism and atheism together. Now, the term agnostic, in its broadest meaning, would be somebody who says you can't know anything for sure. And you may recall some of the fun we've had with that before. When somebody says you can't know anything for sure, the proper response is, are you sure of that? Of course, immediately you have them backpedaling badly. Well, no, but I think I am. Well, are you sure that you think you are? Well, I don't know. Well, are you sure that you don't know? See, that would be total agnosticism, and that's a little hard to push. But some people will say, with respect to God's existence, they'll say, I'm agnostic. Now, to be an agnostic could mean, again, more than one thing, and here we kind of have to pick up atheism too. The atheist denies the existence of God. A true agnostic would be somebody who says, I just don't know whether God exists or not. But usually when people say that they're agnostics, what they really mean is they don't know whether God exists, but they don't believe that he does. That's what they really mean by it. And usually they're not, if you're going to be an agnostic, for heaven's sakes, be humble about it. I mean, if you don't know something, okay, I grant you don't know it. But please don't predicate your ignorance of me. Just because you don't know it doesn't mean I don't know it. Just because you don't know it doesn't mean somebody else doesn't know it. But if you say you don't know whether God exists, keep the bad news to yourself. But that isn't usually what the agnostic does he? The agnostic usually is what we may call a dogmatic agnostic. He's not only sure that God doesn't exist, he's sure that you can't know that God exists. It's just like the general agnostic, as indefensible as his position may be. Have you ever run into one? What they're saying is, I don't know anything for sure, and you don't either. My gosh, they know a lot. They know that they don't know anything, and they know everything you know, and they know you don't know anything either. Which means they got to know all about you and know why you don't know anything. That's an amazing statement. So too with the, go ahead.
My observation is some people who call themselves agnostics may be just saying that they're not interested or it's not something worth caring about rather than...
Yeah, that's right. It comes in all flavors. That's a distinction between what you might call a practical atheist and a theoretical atheist. A practical atheist is equivalent, probably pretty close to a dogmatic agnostic. Because a practical atheist is somebody who says, I don't know whether God exists or not, and I don't care. Or, to be more concrete, I'm going to live as though he doesn't. I had a friend once who was an attorney, a blind attorney. He was, in fact, the first graduate of the University of Michigan Law School as an attorney. And he told me once, he said, I don't know whether God exists or not, but I'm going to live as if he doesn't, and then when I die, if I find out I was wrong, I'll plead ignorance. I suspect our good counselor here probably would think that was not a very good legal position, is it, before the court? But that's what we mean by practical atheism. They don't know whether God exists or not, but they're going to live as though he doesn't. The dogmatic agnostic doesn't know whether God exists or not, but in some ways he is more absolute than the practical atheist, because he's not just living as though God does not exist, he's speaking as though God in fact does not exist. One is more in the order of the will, the other's in the intellect. The practical atheist, in the order of the will, he just doesn't care, and he's not going to follow anything, and he's probably not terribly interested in religion anyway. Probably not. And of course, what's really at issue is the question of objective truth. A lot of people you run into don't have much sense of objective truth. They're very good at talking about subjective truth. They're very good about talking about how everybody's got different views, and they're happy to talk about millions of different religions and so forth, but they're not really as keen when it comes to pursuing the question of, well, is there any such thing as truth? And can you have multiple truths even if they conflict with each other? Just as could you have multiple religions even though they contradict each other? Is there a true philosophy? Well, I would say it's not hard to show, because all you've got to do is take any set of propositions. For example, is reality only material, or are there some things that are not material? Answer yes or no. Go one way or the other. Once you've answered the question, one answer is false, the other is true, and so on. Does man have a free will? Yes or no? And one is true and the other is false. Well, as you go through an interminable list of such questions about the world, the true philosophy is the set of all the true answers. And any philosophy that reflects all of those true answers is the true philosophy. Now, don't confuse knowing all about everything with possessing some true philosophy. We live in a world in which most people think you can't know anything for sure, and everything, they think philosophers claim to know everything. No, philosophers don't claim to know everything. If you know even a few things for yourself, remember, you don't have any philosophy except that which you yourself understand. It's not what I say. It's not what you memorize from me or from a book or from some great authority. It's what you yourself understand. Do you believe that 2 and 2 is 4 because I said it? I could tell you 2 and 2 is 5. It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? What's wrong with it? You accept 4 because, not because I said it, but because you understand it. That's true because you understand that it's true. It's not just true for you, it's true for everybody. If you're trying to count sheep or count horses or count dollar bills, it's going to work the same way for everybody. So what is at issue there is a sense of objective truth. And when it comes to agnosticism and agnostics and atheists, you'll find many of them are just up to their eyebrows in subjectivism, relativism, and a loss of a sense of objective truth. I remember having an argument with somebody once when I was quite young about God, and finally she got very frustrated with me and said, well, I guess your God is just different than my God. Well, okay, but the problem is, how many gods have we got? And if it turns out there's only one God, we better come out with the same answers, or somebody's going to be right and somebody's going to be wrong. So the sense of, it's just in a sense frustrating to me to see how many people do not have a sense of objective truth. I suspect most all of you do, and that's precisely why you're here and you're trying to perfect it and try to understand what objective truth is. But you have to remember, I have to remember, that there's a lot of people that just don't have that. They're going through their whole life as fuzzy beings. Nothing is really clear. And it's all just a matter of putting it to a poll. See how many people, what percentage of people think, if you want to know what's morality today, do the Gallup poll. Ask how many people affirm that it's okay to have extramarital sex. And if 57% say it is, well, that's what contemporary morality is. Of course, that's not morality, that's simply a poll about what people think about moral values. Or more likely, it's probably what they're doing rather than what they think is right. But be that as it may, that doesn't answer the question. If 57% say something's right and 43% say it's wrong, how do we split the difference? Can something be 57% right and 43% wrong? One thing? One issue? No, it's either right or wrong, and either 43% are wrong about it or 57% are wrong about it. But somebody is. Again, though, to come back to our agnostic and atheism. A theoretical atheist is someone who would claim to demonstrate the non-existence of God. I guess a theoretical agnostic would be one who would claim to demonstrate that you cannot demonstrate the existence of God. That's a wee bit different. The agnostic, in other words, is someone who says, I do not know that there is a God. The atheist is someone who says, I know that there is not a God. I'll run that past you again. The atheist says, I know that there is not a God. The agnostic says, I do not know there is a God. But of course, usually what the agnostic means is, I do not know there is a God, and I guess he's suggesting that he knows enough about the subject matter to be able to conclude that no one can know there is a God. That of course, is the point at which Dr. Waters would challenge them to explain to him the five ways and all the principles entailed therein and all the logical moves contained and how the conclusion follows and why it concludes falsely. Because if you're going to claim that no proof for God is valid, you'd better come up with a demonstration of why it's impossible to make such a demonstration. That's an amazing claim. You're claiming that you know all about the proofs for God's existence and you can refute all of them in all their forms. Now, of course, many times you'll hear people say this about the five ways. They'll say, oh, St. Thomas, what did he know about it? Those five ways, they're all wrong. But if they're going to say that, they better show that they know the five ways. And I would assure you, invariably, they don't. They probably have never read them themselves, or if they had. You see, the problem with the five ways is if you read them, what are they? They're 5 little paragraphs. And if you look at them by themselves, well, clearly with no philosophical background training or capability, they're not going to prove anything to you. But one must remember, St. Thomas is writing the five ways at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, the summary of theology. They're not intended to be a complete course in metaphysics and natural theology. Didn't intend that at all. Because after all, he was writing it for students who already had studied several years of philosophy, most of whom would have already studied the commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. These are people who knew all about philosophy. All he was doing is coming in and saying, look, these are basically the 5 arguments of Aristotle. This is my take on them. This is my spin. You know how they go. I don't have to tell you. You know what the steps are. You know the principles involved. He wasn't trying to give the entire demonstration. If you're going to give a complete demonstration, you've got to unpack the arguments and show each step and show where they are, why each step is true and how each one relates to the other. This, if you want to do it properly, I would suggest that you go read Father Garrigou-Lagrange's God, His Existence and His Nature, Volume 1, which treats of the proofs for God's existence, 2/3 of which is addressed to epistemological and metaphysical analyses of the first principles, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, identity, causality, which are then used in the five ways. It's only the last third or so of the book where he actually deals with the five ways. And it's a massive volume, 500, 600, 700 pages. I don't remember how many. I think it's more like 500. But it's not 5 little paragraphs. More than that, what was St. Thomas writing? The Summa Theologiae. What do you first have to know before you have a summary of theology? You have to know that God exists. And you've got to be absolutely sure of it. Why in heaven's name would he create an edifice whose foundation is like a pyramid upside down, balancing on a little tiny point of 5 tiny paragraphs, not explained really at all? He'd have to have been insane to do that. Clearly, he didn't do it. He wasn't trying to prove God's existence there. He was just trying to remind his students of that which they already knew about doing it. And as a matter of fact, he does it in the Summa Contra Gentiles with somewhat greater detail, which was a work written earlier. So if you overwork the five ways and try to make them do what they cannot do and weren't intended to do, then surely they can easily be rejected. And that's what many modern people do. As a matter of fact, one of the problems is that if you don't know the tradition of Thomism, you're not going to know how to read the five ways, are you? And this is the problem that you see in many contemporary philosophers who will do a history of philosophy, and when they come to the five ways, they spin their quick reading of it and usually make egregious errors in interpretation. For example, the most common error is to think that the causality in it goes back through time, which of course it does not. But that takes a lot of explaining. So clearly, to be only fair to the philosophers, a historian of philosophy has the difficulty of knowing or claiming to know very well every major historical position. How in heaven's name can anybody do that? Bertrand Russell wrote a fairly decent history of philosophy in which he points out that I think he was talking about Leibniz's philosophy, he claimed to know that very well, but he admitted that you couldn't know all the others equally well. So when you study the history of philosophy, you have to study a number of historians, not simply one. And when modern philosophers look at the five ways, especially those who in most English-speaking universities probably have a background largely influenced by linguistic analysis and scientific materialism, they look at the five ways and they haven't got a clue. So that they really do not, even if they had a course where they're mentioned, they really don't know them well enough to know what they would be rejecting and rejecting them. So there's much to be said for learning your philosophy within a school of philosophy where the people who are teaching you are well experienced because they were taught by others who knew what this meant. There's, in other words, a tradition that is handed down.
And a language.
And a formal language in which terms are defined so that they are understood with the same meaning by everybody. And what am I telling you? I'm not telling you something I invented. I'm telling you what my teachers taught me. And they taught me what they were taught in turn, and so forth. Okay, any questions about agnosticism or atheism that we haven't touched upon? I know we probably could touch upon them more.
In some agnostic people are claiming that there is some architect of the universe. They do believe.
Well, then they wouldn't really be good agnostics.
No.
You got to be a good agnostic if you're going to be one.
For example, lots of Freemasons, they call themselves agnostics.
They have a supreme being, but they're not. But they do affirm that there is a supreme being, but without any personal relation. That actually is the next point. Deism.
Yeah.
Deism. God creates the world. It has nothing further to do with it. That is Freemasonry in its original form. That doesn't mean you'll run into a lot of Masons, of course, at the lowest level who are good Christians from their perspective. They don't realize that if they accepted it at the highest level, they really could not accept any revelation at all. If God creates the world and sends it on its way, it has nothing further to do with it, well, clearly he's not going to be revealing anything. Nor is he going to interfere with the world by doing something like giving revelation or miracles. Not going to do anything of that sort. So quite naturally, deism, unfortunately, sets one up for atheism. Because with deism, if God creates the world and sets it on its way, it has nothing further to do with it. And this is something you find more in the 17th century, particularly in France, for example, the 18th century in France. I think it would be more the 18th century.
Jefferson too, right? Thomas Jefferson was a deist.
18th century.
Yeah, that'd be 18th century. Right. Clearly, if God creates the world, gets it going on its way, what you've done is set up a circumstance in which the world makes sense by itself. And of course, the scientist is studying the world, studying the way things work in nature, and pretty soon you get to that famous remark that, was it Laplace made to Napoleon? When Napoleon asked this great astronomer, what place do you have for God in all of your theoretical explanations of the universe? Laplace replied, I have no need of any such hypothesis. I don't need God. My formulas explain it all. And this, of course, is what happens with deism. God becomes so separated from the universe and from the world, the only thing worth studying is the world itself, and quite naturally there is a tendency, the temptation, to say that the world is all that there is and you don't need to have anything else to explain it. Its own natural laws explain everything. And of course, that's what leads to naturalism, which is down a couple points. These are not in any perfect order. And I'm not really trying to, you could get into a lot of history here, but that probably would not serve our purpose too much. An anti-theist, most of the people you run into who say they're atheists, like Madeleine Murray O'Hair, they're not atheists. They're anti-theists. A good atheist should just, go in the closet and turn out the light. For heaven's sakes, as I said before, keep the bad news to yourself. The anti-theist is a rabid atheist, out to convert the world to atheism, usually with the, at least apparently good intentions, that theism, religion in all its forms, is to be blamed for every evil found in the world, and therefore to create an enlightened body politic, an enlightened society which can make true progress, we must stamp out religion. And that indeed is what many of them have set out to do, even to the present moment. So the people you run into that call themselves atheists usually are really anti-theists. They're very aggressively atheistic. Pantheism we have to throw in there a little bit. That would be the people who confuse God and the world. God is the world. The world is God. Sometimes they'll say, well, I believe in God, but for me, God is nature. Well, okay. What they mean is they believe in nature. Remember, I told you before that when somebody gives you, when they say, but I mean by it this, what they're doing is they're departing from the traditional notion of God, and they know they're departing from the traditional notion. So they feel called upon to give it the qualification. I believe in God, but what I mean by God, now they're going to give you their God. Their God is nature. If they're a dog, it might be a fire hydrant. It depends on what it is they're worshiping. But for the naturalist, a naturalist is somebody who holds that the natural world is the only thing that exists and it's self-explanatory. The pantheist, I'm almost tempted to say, would be a naturalist who gets kind of romantic and poetic about nature.
They are.
Amen. So most people that are naturalists are simply scientific materialists. They are atheists. They are dogmatic agnostics. They would maintain the only thing that exists is nature, and if they want to get really religious about it, they'll spell nature with a capital N. But that's as far as it goes. There's nothing beyond nature. Nature explains itself. And of course, St. Thomas, in the Five Ways, he raises two objections. One is the problem of evil, and the other one is simply to say, well, nature just explains everything. He foresaw the objection that would be raised by David Hume and other materialists centuries later, who would simply say, what do we need God for? Nature explains everything. And indeed, they're right. If nature did explain everything, you wouldn't need God. The point of every proof for God's existence is an examination of nature which finds that it is not self-explanatory. It needs something else to explain it. The physical world by itself is incomplete, unintelligible. It's there, but it shouldn't be there. But if you're a materialist or a naturalist, as one of them put it to me, you would say, well, it's just a brute fact that the world is here, and it doesn't need any further explanation. Why, they would say, do you think that having a first cause really gets you any further? Because when you get to that first cause, the first cause is just there and doesn't have any explanation. So what's the difference? Why not just leave it with this world? Well, the reason there's a difference is that if you examine this world, the kinds of being that make up this world, finite, movable, contingent beings which are acting for ends that they don't explain within themselves. And of course, every natural scientist believes firmly that there are natural laws within the universe which direct the motion of everything. I don't care what their laws are. They may reduce them just to one or two little principles. They've always got a structure, and they've always got things acting a certain way because of that structure. A universe of such things, when you examine it carefully, doesn't explain itself. It doesn't explain why it is when it need not be. It doesn't explain why it's becoming when it isn't the future states that are to be realized when it does become. It doesn't explain where causality originates from in a world where things are constantly causing effects. It doesn't explain why some things are better than others when there is no standard against which to measure them. In other words, what the traditional metaphysician does is to very carefully examine the universe, examine what we call creation, and finds that it of itself doesn't explain itself. No, you're forced by reason to the existence of a being which is not like this world. But because it's not like this world, because it is infinite, because it is a necessary being and self-existent in itself, it does not need a prior cause. It is a being which is its own reason for being. Every effect needs a cause. An effect is a being whose sufficient reason for being is not totally within itself. If it doesn't fully explain itself, something else has to. Every finite being is an effect. Everything in the universe is an effect and needs a cause. But a being which is its own reason for being can be not only its own reason for being, but can be the reason for being for every effect. So that God, it's perfectly consistent to say God is the first cause uncaused, the cause of everything in the universe, but does not need a prior cause, because unlike all those effects that he is creating, he is not himself an effect, but rather is his own reason for being. Because he is self-existent, he is a being in which essence and existence are identical. Okay, any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to stop right here. Thank you. Good night.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.